People always say that when your world falls apart, you feel it coming. A shift in the air, a change in the way someone looks at you, a sense that something isn't quite right. I never felt it, not until it was too late. I stood on the terrace of the Astoria Grand, my fingers wrapped around a half-empty glass of whiskey, watching the city sprawl out beneath me. The ballroom behind me was alive with music and laughter, the sounds of my daughter's pre-wedding celebration echoing through the golden-lit halls. Inside, guests clinked glasses, my wife charmed the room, and my best friend stood somewhere in the crowd, probably telling some elaborate story to a group of enraptured listeners. Everything looked perfect, but something was wrong. I had felt it all evening, the way Vanessa, my wife of 15 years, kept glancing toward Marco when she thought no one was watching. The way Marco, my best friend, looked just a little too comfortable in my world. The way my younger children, Harrison and Sophie, seemed drawn to him in a way that had never felt quite normal. It had been gnawing at me for weeks, but tonight, it was like a weight pressing against my chest. Something wasn't right. I took a slow sip of my drink, letting the burns settle in my throat. I needed to shake this off. Alice, my oldest, was getting married tomorrow. This was supposed to be a celebration, a night of joy. And yet, I couldn't enjoy it. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if I really knew the people I had built my world around. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting some hospital matter. An emergency, a last-minute call for a consult. Instead, it was a number I didn't recognize. Unknown number. We need to talk. Now. It's about your family. A cold ripple went through me. I stared at the screen for a moment before typing back. Me. Who is this? The reply came almost instantly. Unknown number. Maya Brooks. Private investigator. I have information you need. Meet me in the business center. 10 minutes. Alone. I exhaled slowly, my fingers tightening around my phone. For a long moment, I just stood there, the city glowing beneath me, the sounds of celebration behind me. Then, without a word, I set my drink down, straightened my jacket, and walked inside. The business center was dimly lit, empty except for a woman standing near the back, a leather briefcase resting on the desk beside her. She was in her 30s, dark-haired, sharp-eyed. She looked like someone who had seen things she wished she hadn't. She glanced up as I stepped inside, shutting the door behind me. "You're Dr. Hudson," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. "And you're the one sending cryptic messages." She studied me for a second, then slid a thick folder across the desk. "You might want to sit down." I didn't. I just flipped open the folder. The first page was a financial record, then another, and another. Wire transfers, private accounts, trust funds with my family's names attached. But not mine. I turned the page. Medical files. Genetic markers. 3 names at the top. Alice Hudson. Harrison Hudson. Sophie Hudson. I skimmed down to the most important part. Not a match. My breath didn't hitch. My hands didn't shake. My face didn't change. But something inside me broke. Maya was watching me carefully. "It started as an investment fraud case," she said. "A client hired me to look into irregular transactions linked to Dr. Marco Salvatore. Money moving through private trusts, disguised as academic grants." I flipped another page. Marco's name was all over it. Maya hesitated. "Your wife's name came up in the process." I closed the folder. Slowly, deliberately. "And?" Her voice softened. "Your children aren't biologically yours, Dr. Hudson." I had already known. Somewhere deep in my gut, I had already known. But hearing it spoken aloud was different. It made it real. Maya continued, her tone cautious now. "Marco has been making deposits into your children's accounts since they were born. Education funds, trust payments, even personal gifts, all funneled through financial backdoors to avoid your notice. He wasn't just a friend to your family. He was their provider." I exhaled through my nose. "And Vanessa?" She knew. Maya's voice was quiet now. "From the beginning." A slow, bitter laugh escaped me. 15 years. 15 years of Vanessa kissing me, whispering "I love you," reaching for my hand in the middle of the night. 15 years of Marco sitting across from me at family dinners, playing the role of best friend, watching me raise his children. 15 years of a lie. I placed my hands on the desk, pressing down slightly, grounding myself. Does anyone else know? No, Maya said. But if you want to expose them, I have everything you need. I was silent for a long moment. Then, I nodded. Send me everything. Maya hesitated. Dr. Hudson, what are you planning to do? I met her gaze, my voice even. What I do best. I returned to the ballroom like nothing had happened. Vanessa spotted me first, weaving through the guests with effortless grace. She touched my arm, smiling up at me. There you are, she murmured. I was starting to think you ran off. I smiled at her, smooth, easy, just handling some last-minute details. She ran a finger down the lapel of my jacket. You've been quiet tonight. I kissed her cheek lightly. Just thinking about tomorrow. She sighed, content. It's going to be perfect. I brushed a strand of hair from her face. It really is. She had no idea. Across the room, Marco lifted his glass toward me in a silent toast. I lifted mine in return. I had spent my life removing tumors, cutting out the parts of the body that threatened to destroy the whole. Tomorrow, I was going to do the same. Only this time, the operation would be personal. I woke up before the sun, staring at the ceiling. The room was quiet except for the soft breathing beside me. Vanessa. For a moment, I just lay there, listening. I should have felt something. Rage, heartbreak, anything. But all I felt was the slow, dull weight of finality. I turned my head slightly, watching her in the dim morning light. Her face was relaxed, peaceful, her lips slightly parted as she slept. She looked beautiful. She always had. For 15 years, I thought I knew her. 15 years of morning kisses, inside jokes, shared looks across dinner tables. 15 years of raising children together, of late-night whispers about their futures, of believing we were a team. 15 years of being a fool. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to breathe. I could have woken her up right then, shaken her until her eyes flew open, demanded answers, demanded why. But I already knew, and it didn't matter anymore. Instead, I slipped out of bed, moving carefully, like a surgeon making his first incision. She stirred slightly, sighing as she rolled over, but she didn't wake. She had no idea. She had no idea that by the end of today, everything she had built, everything she had stolen, would be nothing but dust. I moved through the morning like a ghost, shaved, got dressed, smiled when Vanessa kissed my cheek, let her touch linger on my arm, let her believe that today was just another perfect day. She was glowing as she sat by the vanity, applying her makeup. Alice is going to be so beautiful. I can't believe we made it to this day. Her voice was warm, affectionate. I looked at her through the mirror, and for the first time in my life, I didn't recognize the woman staring back at me. I forced a smile. Yeah, it's going to be unforgettable. She beamed. I'll check on the girls. You should go down soon. William's probably waiting for you. I nodded. I'll see you there. And then she was gone. I exhaled slowly, reaching into the closet, pulling out my jacket. My hand brushed against something in the inner pocket. The envelope. The weight of it was solid, heavy. Evidence. Proof. The blade I was about to drive into the heart of this illusion. I checked my watch. 3 hours until the ceremony. I straightened my tie, ran a hand over my hair, and walked out the door. The cathedral was stunning. Rows of white orchids. Aisles lined with flickering candlelight. Guests murmuring softly, their laughter bouncing off the high-arched ceilings. This was supposed to be a day of joy. Instead, it was going to be a funeral. I stood near the front, greeting guests, shaking hands. My body moved on autopilot. My face set in an easy, practiced expression. William Grayson clapped my back, grinning. Exciting day, huh? I nodded, giving him the same polite smile I'd given 1,000 times before. Exciting indeed. His wife, Caroline, sighed dreamily. Vanessa must be so proud. I glanced toward the front row. She sat there, glowing in gold, her smile effortless, her posture perfect. She looked like a woman who had everything. She thought she had one. I smiled faintly. She is. She had no idea. The music changed. I turned, and there was Alice. My daughter. She stood at the entrance of the cathedral, her gown flowing around her, her bouquet trembling slightly in her hands. She was breathtaking. She was innocent. She had no idea the storm that was about to hit. I swallowed hard, forcing my face to stay neutral as she reached for my arm. "Dad," she whispered, "I'm so happy." My chest ached. I had spent my life protecting her, keeping her safe from the world. And now, I was the one about to break her heart. I forced a small smile, covering her hand with mine. "You look beautiful." She beamed, her fingers tightening around my arm. "Ready?" I nodded once. We took our first step forward. Then, the usher appeared. Everything slowed. I watched as he made his way toward William first, handing him the thick envelope. I saw William's face shift, confusion, then recognition, then something sharper. His fingers tightened around the papers, his jaw locking. Then, in a voice that sent a chill down my spine, he said, "What the hell is this?" Alice flinched beside me. "Dad." I didn't move, didn't speak, didn't need to. Caroline took the papers next, gasping as her hand flew to her mouth. Blake frowned. "What's going on?" William turned slowly, his gaze locking onto Vanessa. "Vanessa," he said, voice dark and clipped, "do you want to explain this?" She stilled. Her perfect, practiced poise faltered for the first time. I don't understand," she murmured. Blake took the papers next. His face went pale as he scanned them. Then he looked up, straight at Alice. "You lied to me." Alice's breath hitched. "What?" Blake turned the papers toward her, his hands shaking. "You knew." Alice blinked. "Blake, I don't." He shoved the papers into her hands. "Read them." Her fingers trembled as she looked down. The color drained from her face. Her bouquet slipped from her fingers, white roses scattering across the marble floor. She turned to her mother. "Mom." Vanessa was frozen. Alice's voice broke. "Mom, tell me this isn't true." Vanessa opened her mouth, then closed it. William took a step forward, voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "You let my son believe he was marrying into an honest family. You let this man raise children that weren't his." Alice's head snapped toward me, her eyes wide, desperate. "Dad." My throat tightened. I wanted to protect her. I wanted to tell her everything would be okay. But I couldn't. Because this moment, the destruction of the lie, was necessary. Blake's voice was sharp. "The prenup?" He turned to his father. "We didn't sign it yet." William exhaled. "Then thank God for that." Alice reached for Blake's hand, but he stepped back. "I can't do this." Alice's face crumbled. "Blake." "I can't marry you," he said louder this time. The room erupted into whispers. I stood completely still. Vanessa turned to me now, desperation in her eyes. "David, please." I looked at her, at the woman I had loved, at the woman who had lied to me every single day for 15 years. And I realized something. I wasn't sad. I wasn't angry. I was done. I took a slow step back, my voice quiet. "No." Vanessa's lips parted, but no sound came out. Marco hadn't moved. He just sat there, watching. For the first time, he looked unsure. Because he knew. It was over. I had spent my life making precise, calculated incisions, removing what didn't belong. And today had been no different. The lie was gone, and I had finally cut them out. The weight of what I had done didn't hit me until I was alone. The moment I stepped into the hotel suite and shut the door behind me, the silence felt different. Heavier. I leaned against the counter, pressing my palms into the cool marble, exhaling slowly. My body was still humming with adrenaline, my hands steady, but inside, something deep and quiet had begun to unravel. Alice was gone. Not just from the cathedral. From me. I had seen it in her eyes before she ran. The betrayal. The devastation. She hadn't known. She really hadn't known. And I had shattered her anyway. I ran a hand down my face, inhaling sharply, trying to shake the image of her standing there. Her wedding dress pooling around her feet, her fingers clutching those papers like they had physically hurt her. Had I done the right thing? For 15 years, I had been living inside a lie. But Alice hadn't, and I had torn her world apart like it was nothing. I closed my eyes, gripping the edge of the counter. I had told myself this was necessary, that the truth needed to come out, no matter how much it hurt. But now? Now, I wasn't so sure. I didn't go back to the ballroom. Didn't try to find Vanessa. Didn't go looking for Alice, though I wanted to. God, I wanted to. I just sat in the quiet of the suite, the city buzzing outside the window, my body finally starting to register the exhaustion I had been keeping at bay. Then, a knock. I ignored it at first. Then another, harder this time. I sighed, pushing myself up, bracing for whatever came next. When I opened the door, I was expecting Vanessa. Maybe Alice. But it was Marco. He stood there, still in his suit, tie loosened, his usually composed face unreadable. For the first time in all the years I had known him, he looked uncertain. He studied me, then exhaled a short laugh. Well, that was dramatic. I stared at him. I had imagined this moment 100 different ways, had pictured punching him, screaming at him, throwing him against the wall and demanding answers. But standing here now, I felt nothing, just a quiet, steady exhaustion. You have some nerve showing up here, I said finally. Marco shrugged, slipping his hands into his pockets. I figured you might want to talk. I let out a humorless laugh. Talk? I get it, David. His voice was careful now. You're pissed. You feel betrayed. But you didn't just destroy my life in there. You burned everything. Your family. Your daughter's wedding. Was that worth it? Something flickered in his eyes. Maybe anger. Maybe desperation. You don't get to stand here and act like I'm the one who ruined everything, I said, my voice quiet but sharp. You took my family from me before I ever stepped foot in that cathedral. Marco's jaw clenched. I didn't take anything. You were just too blind to see what was right in front of you. For the first time, a flicker of heat rose in my chest. You think that makes it better? He sighed, shaking his head. Look, you needed to know. I get that. But Alice? Sophie? Harrison? You blew up their lives too. I stepped forward, closing the space between us. You blew up their lives the moment you decided to sleep with my wife. Marco's lips pressed into a thin line. But he didn't deny it. Didn't apologize, either. Of course he didn't. Men like Marco never did. I let out a breath, shaking my head. Get the hell out of my hotel? For a second, I thought he might argue. But then he nodded, stepping back. He turned, walking down the hall without another word. I shut the door, locked it. Then, I pressed my back against it and let out a slow, shaky breath. My hands weren't shaking. My heart wasn't racing. But inside, something in me felt broken. Maybe it always would. I found Alice that night. Not because I went looking for her. Because she found me. I was sitting in the dark, nursing a glass of whiskey, the city stretching out beneath me, when the door clicked open. For a second, I thought I was imagining it. But then, soft footsteps, a hesitant inhale. Then, Dad. Her voice was small, hoarse, like she had been crying for hours. I turned, my chest tightening at the sight of her. She was still in her dress, but her veil was gone. Her makeup was smudged. Her eyes were red, swollen. She looked wrecked. Because of me. I set the glass down, rising slowly. Alice. She just stared at me. Then, she shook her head, blinking hard. Why? Her voice cracked on the word, and it nearly broke me. I swallowed. Because you deserved the truth. Her breath hitched. Then why does it feel like you lied to me, too? I exhaled, raking a hand through my hair. Alice. You knew. She took a shaky step forward. You knew before I ever put on this dress. Before I ever walked into that church. Before I ever stood next to Blake and said I do. She choked on the last word. And God, I hated myself for it. I took a step toward her, my voice low. I wanted to protect you. She let out a soft, broken laugh. Protect me? You humiliated me. Her voice was rising now, cracking under the weight of everything. You stood there and watched me walk into that church, knowing you were about to rip my life apart. You let me believe I was safe. And then you ripped it all away. Tears slipped down her cheeks. She was shaking. I wanted to pull her close, tell her that I had done this for her, that it had to be this way. But I didn't, because I knew she wouldn't believe me. Not yet. Maybe not ever. So instead, I whispered the only thing I could. I'm sorry. Alice let out a soft, shattered breath. Then, she stepped back. And for the second time that day, she walked away from me. This time, I didn't stop her. I stayed in the hotel suite for 3 more nights. Didn't answer my phone. Didn't check my emails. Didn't even look at the news, though I knew the headlines would be brutal. Manhattan's society wedding ends in chaos. Betrayal, lies, and a walkout at the Hudson Grayson wedding. When the past catches up, Dr. David Hudson's family scandal. I didn't care. I had already lost the only thing that mattered. On the 4th day, I packed a bag, checked out of the hotel, and left New York. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Not Vanessa. Not Marco. Not even Alice. I just walked out of the city I had built my life in, and never looked back. I left New York without a plan. Just a duffel bag, a one-way ticket, and the overwhelming need to disappear. The city had never felt smaller than it did in those last few days. Everywhere I went, I felt the weight of the whispers, the stares, the unspoken questions. People didn't need to say it out loud. I could see it in their faces. There goes the man who destroyed his own family. I tried not to care. Tried to convince myself that it didn't matter. That the people who really knew me, the people who really mattered, would understand one day. But the truth was, I wasn't sure I believed that anymore. Because Alice was gone. Not physically. I knew she was still in the city, holed up in her apartment, avoiding the world just as much as I was. But in every way that mattered, she had left me. She hadn't answered my calls, hadn't replied to my texts. The last words she had spoken to me were still ringing in my head, over and over again, like a wound that refused to close. You lied to me, too. It had been weeks, and I still didn't know how to fix it. Maybe I never would. I ended up in Boston, not because I had a particular reason to be there, just because it wasn't New York. I found a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. Furnished, quiet, nothing special. The kind of place that didn't feel like home but didn't feel like a prison, either. It was exactly what I needed. Something temporary. Something that didn't ask anything of me. For the first time in my life, I had no real obligations. No patients waiting for me in the OR. No family to go home to. No carefully scheduled routines that dictated how my days unfolded. I had nothing but time. And for the first few weeks, I did absolutely nothing with it. I slept. I went for long walks with no destination. I sat in coffee shops, listening to strangers talk about their lives, about their meaningless little problems that felt so far from my reality. And I tried not to think about her. About Alice. About the look on her face when she realized what I had done. About the way she had stepped back from me, like I was a stranger. Like I was the one who had betrayed her. It didn't matter that I had spent my life protecting her, that I had loved her with everything I had. In the end, all she saw was the wreckage I left behind. And I couldn't blame her for that. One night, I found myself sitting in a small bar near my apartment, nursing a whiskey that I wasn't really drinking. The place was nearly empty. Just a few scattered patrons, a bartender who looked half asleep, and an old man in the corner watching a baseball game on mute. It was the kind of place where no one asked questions, where no one cared who you were or why you were there. Which was exactly why I had come. I stared at the glass in front of me, swirling the amber liquid slowly, letting my mind drift. Then, my phone buzzed. I almost didn't check it. I had gotten used to ignoring my phone. It was never anything important anymore, just work emails I didn't care about, missed calls from people I wasn't ready to talk to. But something made me look. And when I did, my breath caught. Alice, where are you? I stared at the screen, my pulse suddenly too loud in my ears. For a second, I thought I was imagining it. Then, before I could even think of how to respond, another text. Alice, can we talk? My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I had imagined this moment 100 times, had replayed all the things I wanted to say to her, all the ways I wanted to apologize, to explain, to make her understand. But now that she was actually reaching out, I had no idea what to say. After a long moment, I typed 2 words. Me, I'm in Boston. I hesitated. Then, before I could overthink it, me, come find me. Alice didn't respond right away. I stared at my phone for what felt like forever, waiting for those three little dots to appear. They didn't. Maybe she had changed her mind. Maybe she had sent that message in a moment of weakness, regret, or curiosity and now realized she wasn't ready. Maybe she had just wanted to know where I was so she could make peace with the fact that I wasn't a part of her life anymore. I finished my drink, paid the bill, and walked back to my apartment, feeling like I had just swallowed something sharp and bitter. She had reached out, and now she was gone again. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. 2 days later, she showed up. It was raining. A light drizzle, the kind that didn't warrant an umbrella but still left you damp and miserable if you stood outside too long. I had just gotten back from a run, the kind that wasn't really about fitness and more about trying to outrun my own thoughts. My shirt was damp with sweat, my heartbeat still a little too fast. And there she was, standing in front of my building. Alice. She looked different. Not in any dramatic way, but in the kind of way that happens when someone has been through hell and come out the other side. Her face was thinner, sharper. Her eyes looked older. She was still beautiful, still my little girl in a way that made my heart ache, but she was no longer the version of her I had carried in my head for months. She was something new, something I no longer knew how to reach. We stood there for a moment, just looking at each other. Neither of us spoke. She was the first to break the silence. "This is where you've been?" Her voice wasn't angry, just tired. I exhaled. "Yeah." She nodded slowly, like she was filing that information away. I had no idea what to say to her. What words could possibly make any of this better? I wanted to say I was sorry. I wanted to tell her I hadn't meant to hurt her. I wanted to tell her that I had been drowning in the truth, that I had done what I thought was right, even if it had cost me everything. Instead, all I said was, "Do you want to come in?" She hesitated, then nodded. The apartment was small. Just a couch, a kitchen, a bedroom that barely fit a bed. It wasn't home. It was just a place. She walked in slowly, taking it all in. "This is different," she said. I huffed a quiet laugh, rubbing a towel over my damp hair. "Yeah, it is." She glanced at the bookshelf, the barely touched stack of mail on the counter, the whiskey bottle on the table, still half full. She took a breath. "You really left?" I nodded. "I had to." She folded her arms, shifting on her feet. "Why Boston?" I shrugged. "It wasn't New York." She nodded like that made sense. Maybe it did. I motioned toward the couch. "Sit." She hesitated but finally lowered herself onto the worn cushions. I sat across from her, leaning forward, resting my elbows on my knees. She stared at me for a long time before finally speaking. "Why did you do it like that?" Straight to the point. Just like me. I ran a hand through my hair, sighing. "Because there was no other way." Alice let out a quiet, bitter laugh. "You don't think pulling me aside before my wedding might have been a better option?" I swallowed. "Would you have believed me?" She opened her mouth, then closed it. The truth was, she probably wouldn't have. I leaned forward. "Alice, I needed you to see it. I needed everyone to see it. If I had done it in private, Vanessa would have found a way to spin it, to turn me into the villain." Her eyes flashed. "You were the villain." The words hit harder than I expected. She shook her head, gripping her hands together in her lap. "You humiliated me. You let me walk down that aisle thinking I had a future, thinking I had everything I'd ever wanted, and then you ripped it away." I felt a lump form in my throat. "I know," I said quietly. Her jaw tightened. "So why does it feel like you never gave me a choice?" I let out a slow breath. "Because you didn't have one. None of us did. The choice was made for us the second your mother decided to lie. The second Marco decided to pretend he was just a family friend." Alice looked away, blinking hard. I could see the war happening inside her. The part of her that hated me for what I had done, and the part of her that hated that I had been right. She exhaled, shaking her head. "You destroyed our family." I looked at her, my chest aching. "No, Alice. It was already destroyed. I just stopped pretending." She swallowed, her throat working. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then, finally, she whispered, "I miss you." The words cracked something deep inside me. I had been prepared for anger, for resentment, but I wasn't prepared for that. I leaned forward, my voice thick. I miss you too, kid. She let out a shaky breath, like she had been holding it in for months. Her hands curled into fists in her lap, then relaxed. I don't know how to forgive you for this, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded slowly. I don't expect you to. She blinked. You don't? No, I said honestly. I don't. Her lips parted slightly, like that surprised her. I sat back, rubbing my jaw. I didn't do this to be forgiven. I did it because I couldn't live in that lie anymore. I did it because you deserve to know the truth, even if it broke you, even if it broke me too. She looked at me, searching my face for something. I had no idea what she was looking for. But then, slowly, hesitantly, she nodded. She wasn't ready to forgive me. But maybe, just maybe, she was ready to start understanding me. And for now, that was enough. Alice stayed. Not for long. Maybe an hour, maybe less. But she stayed. That was more than I had dared to hope for. We didn't talk much after that first moment of honesty. Instead, we sat in the quiet of my apartment, her curled up on the couch, me leaning forward, fingers clasped. She picked at the hem of her sweater, eyes flickering toward me every now and then, like she was trying to see me through a new lens. Like she wasn't sure if she recognized me anymore. I didn't blame her. I wasn't sure I recognized myself either. You know, Mom's still in New York. Her voice was quiet, like she wasn't sure she even wanted to say it. I nodded. I figured. Alice let out a slow breath, her fingers twisting together. She's not doing well. I raised an eyebrow. Vanessa always lands on her feet. Alice flinched slightly, and for a second, I regretted how sharp that sounded. I sighed. Sorry. That was... No. She shook her head, pressing her lips together. You're right. She's always been good at pretending everything is fine. But, she hesitated, then shrugged. She's not pretending as well these days. Something twisted in my gut. I wasn't sure if it was guilt. I didn't want to feel guilty. Not after everything. But 15 years is a long time to be married to someone. It's a long time to build something, even if it turns out to be a lie. Alice glanced at me again, watching for my reaction. I kept my face neutral. She brought this on herself. Alice exhaled, nodding slightly, but I could see the conflict in her expression. I understood it. She still loved her mother, even after everything, even if she didn't want to. And maybe I did too, in some buried, distant way. Not enough to want her back. Not enough to undo what I had done, but enough to feel something at the thought of her alone in that big house, the world she had built crumbling around her. I pushed the thought aside. Alice stretched out her legs, rubbing a hand over her forehead. Sophie and Harrison are staying with her. I nodded. How are they? Alice hesitated, chewing the inside of her cheek. They're angry, she admitted. Mostly at you. I inhaled slowly. I figured. She let out a humorless laugh. I mean, you did kind of blow up their entire existence. I looked at her. Would you rather I hadn't? She hesitated. For the first time, I saw the answer in her eyes before she said it. No. It was barely more than a breath. But it was enough. I nodded, feeling something inside me loosen just slightly. They'll come around, I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. Alice scoffed. You sound pretty confident about that. I shrugged. They have to go through their own process, just like you are. She was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. Then, in a voice so soft I almost didn't hear it, she said, I don't know where to put you in my life anymore. I looked at her, my chest aching. I wanted to tell her that I was still her father, that I always would be, but I knew that wasn't enough. So instead, I said, then don't put me anywhere just yet. She blinked, looking up at me. I leaned back, exhaling. You don't have to figure it out today, or tomorrow, or next year. I'm not going anywhere, Alice. I'll be here when you're ready. She swallowed, her throat working, and then, slowly, hesitantly, she nodded. Not forgiveness. Not yet, but something like hope.